Hi, everyone. It's Leilani, and it's episode four of Story Starters.
Hi, this is Sonia. So Story Starters is a webcast. We're having conversations with and learning about life stories directly from the people who have experienced them. Today's episode is a continuation. We're talking about growing up Gen X. So those that have experienced their childhood through high school years in the 70s, 80s, and the 90s.
Today's guest is Steve Nix. Steve is a Gen X-er born in Dallas, Texas in 1970. He grew up playing sports and enjoying the outdoors with friends and family in what seemed like endless sunny days in the 1970s. By the 1980s, he had become fascinated with figuring out how things worked by taking them apart and reassembling them. Everything from bicycles to motorcycles to cars, early computers and electronics. In high school, he was really active in school activities and clubs while also working at the local grocery store and spending many hours practicing and playing guitar in garage bands. Steve developed an early love of video games and technology, which eventually led to the opportunity to build a career in video games and disruptive technologies like virtual reality, something close to my heart. He still lives in Dallas with his wife, Mary, and their two daughters, who also share a love of music and video games. He also still takes things apart and endurance races old cars at various tracks around the country. Welcome, Steve.
Yeah, thank you, Leilani and Sonia. It's good to see you both again.
Absolutely. Sonia, let's get started.
Okay, we're going to jump right in. We're going to do something fun, really fast, rapid fire questions. So I have about 8 or 9 questions I'm going to ask you, and the first thing that comes to mind, taking you back to growing up Gen X, share the first thought that comes to mind.
Okay.
Ready?
Ready.
Okay. First one, in that time, who was your favorite artist or band?
In the 80s, probably The Cure would be the most dominant band.
Me too. Okay, favorite TV show?
Family Ties.
Family Ties.
Favorite movie?
There was a lot, but I'd say Risky Business if I had to pick one.
That's the Tom Cruise one, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
With a very prominent Porsche.
Yes.
See, it's funny. You went to Porsche, and I went to Tom Cruise in his underwear.
Therefore, it's called Risky Business. Okay, favorite hangout?
The mall.
The mall.
Yeah.
Now, what about a word or saying that you thought was either a favorite or the most common, the one that you used?
It's probably one I still use today, which is excellent.
Excellent.
Excellent. Yeah. Put a little 80s on it.
And then something that you hated about the 70s or 80s?
Let me see. In the 70s, I'd say the cars were absolutely terrible for the most part. And then getting better by the 80s, thankfully.
So the look of the car, or just them themselves?
The looks weren't great. I mean, if you remember the K car and
I remember
minivans and but the engines were terrible with all the restrictions and everything that were being placed, and gas restrictions and all that. So you had Corvettes with big block engines in them with less than 200 horsepower. So it was really the dark days. The glorious 60s. And and then by the 80s, things started to recover a little bit. Cars started getting a lot better, especially the the European brands. But God, I mean, the cars back then were just so god awful.
I did not know that. That's good.
Oh, like remember the Gremlin?
Yeah, the Gremlin was actually a pretty cool car. I got to defend. AMC is near and dear to my heart. So the Gremlins are actually collectible now. So.
Or the Pinto, Ford Pintos.
Yeah, no, that was a terrible car. Exploded.
Right.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to flip it around. What's one thing you loved about the 70s or 80s?
Yeah, I mean, really the one recurring thing between both the 70s and 80s that just the music, it's sort of this soundtrack, for those decades. And there was just so much great music that was made, early 70s to, disco was kind of a low point, but then, recovering, by the late 70s and 80s. And there was just a lot of innovation in music. in the 80s. And just, that's the main thing that was, I really just get a warm and fuzzy feeling about that was, a constant through both decades.
So then if you were to summarize and try and describe the 80s in one word, could you pick a word?
For me, it would be hopeful. Yeah, it was a decade where, for me as a person, and I think for the country and everything, a lot of people just had a lot of hope for what was ahead of us.
Yeah, coming out of some interesting times in the 70s.
Yeah,
for sure.
the 70s were rough, but I think the 80s we were finally starting to recover a bit from that.
Awesome.
That was fun. So those were the rapid fires. That was just kind of a warm up to get you thinking back in the time. That was very nice. We're going to go deeper into your stories. Not too deep.
All right.
You can choose how deep you want to go.
Can you down first?
Can you paint a picture of the landscape of your childhood? Tell us a little bit about what that was like growing up.
Yeah, so I'm from Texas. I was at least a fourth generation Texan, and grew up originally in Dallas, proper, and then my family, like a lot of families, moved out to the suburbs in the 70s, and it was pretty common. I mean, pretty standard suburban lifestyle. Hanging out with friends and everything, and a lot of family around. I mean, I have a huge amount of family here in town and cousins and everything that I grew up with that were around my age. So it was a fun time. And spent a lot of time. My grandparents had a lake house kind of out in the country where they retired to, not too far from here, and so spent a lot of time there. I mean, it was kind of my summer camps out in the country at my grandparents' house. Hanging out, taking stuff apart, working on stuff with my grandfather, who was a really brilliant mechanic and electrician. So just really. Like I said, lots of good times, big family, lots of parties, lots of birthdays, big holidays. But, doing, I guess, pretty standard things for suburban kids, riding bikes and hanging out, going to the mall, going to the arcades, all the things that we did back then.
I feel like kids back then, right? We talked about the mall and the arcades, but I even remember, like, if you were an up and coming music star, you would have concerts in the malls because that's where all the kids were.
Yeah. Well, and I remember, I think it was the Baldwin stores here where, you could go in and kind of try any guitar you wanted to. And we used to spend a lot of time in that store, probably annoying the heck out of the salespeople who really just wish we'd go play bad guitar somewhere else. But yeah, I mean, there's so many things to do. I mean, from the arcade and the movie theater and the stores, and it was air conditioned, which was important in Texas in the summers. So it was a really fun time, and you could go there and spend a few dollars and have a really great afternoon.
So you mentioned, and Leilani mentioned this a little bit in the intro, is you like to tear things apart. Like, was it just cars, or were there other things?
No, it was kind of everything. We didn't have a lot of money growing up, so if I wanted something, a lot of times the way I would get it is I'd find something that was broken, and I'd maybe something that somebody in the family had discarded or something, or was just laying there in a closet. So I'd a lot of times just take it apart and try and figure out if I could fix it or make it better. And a lot of it early on was like bicycles, and always trying to make my bicycle better and cooler and maybe less dorky. So I would always changing stuff out on the bikes and painting them different colors and changing the stickers on them, and I really was like, I would build up a bike and then sell it and then buy a better bike and then fix that one up, and just kept working on them all the time. And then eventually there were like some old motorcycles at my grandparents' house, and some of them weren't working. And when I was hanging out there in the summers, I really wanted I wanted to ride those motorcycles. So I started, I learned to work on those with my grandfather and taking them apart. And there was always something broken. If it was the carburetor or the chain was broken or something with the shocks, or, there always seemed to be something going wrong. So spent a lot of time there. And then I might've mentioned when I was 15, I didn't have money for a car, but at my grandfather's house, there happened to be these old cars that family members had just sort of abandoned over the years, which was something people did a little more often back then, I guess. And so there were several cars laying there, and none of them running, and I picked the best one, I guess, and spent that summer before I turned 16 with my grandfather completely rebuilding it, rebuilding the engine, the interior, painted it, and did all that. And so that's how I got my first car. And then, oh, there it is. Yeah, that's the 70 AMC Javelin, which I said I'm fond of AMCs. So that was the car. It was originally canary yellow, by the way.
Wow, you did a great job.
Thank you. It was painted Porsche India red at this point. So that was after about $200 worth of parts that I had money for, and a lot of labor and a lot of time putting that together. But yeah, it was a great car. Loved it. Miss having it. I wish I still had it. But yeah, it was a lot of fun back then.
So you actually rebuilt this. It wasn't working when you got to it, and by the time you were done with it, it looked gorgeous. And it's a pretty badass muscle car, right?
Yeah, it was nice. I was really glad to have it and proud of it. And I think that I still work on cars today, and I have a number of cars that I end up working on. But I have a 86 BMW 5 Series down in the garage that I've had for years, and I'm the only mechanic that's ever worked on it, including even I do the alignments in the garage. So, still very into cars, and, I race some old cars as well. And we do all the wrenching on those cars as well. So, working on things has just always been kind of in my blood. And then, and then later on in the 80s, I, really started getting into, got my first computers and first electronics, and was really fascinated with, how those work. So next thing I know, I'm taking apart, early computers and upgrading those, and, changing out dip switches and putting RAM in them and all that stuff. So, always, I guess I learned to love to hot rod cars, and now I learned to hot rod, cars, but also technology as well.
So, because you're a builder, you just like to build it, right?
Yeah.
So how was that? I feel like you were building and tearing apart the cars maybe junior high, maybe younger, and then you transition into high school.
Yeah, I was really the bikes and motorcycles and in junior high and elementary, and starting elementary with the bikes, then junior high and with the motorcycles and everything. And then by there I am. Yeah, there I am on my hutch, which that was the bike that I had ultimately built up to by building other bikes and fixing them up and selling them. And somehow I managed to get this. I actually traded an old motorcycle that I'd fixed up for that, and some cash for that bike, which is my dream bike at the time. Hutch and GT were the big brands right there, and I really, really liked Hutch for some reason. And then my poor parents somehow allowed me to build a quarter pipe in my backyard. So that's actually a quarter circle ramp that was in the backyard, and I'd have to get started, I don't know, several blocks away, ride down the alley as fast as I could, and then you'd go up to this ramp and do a tabletop or something, and then come down and land it, then ride back.
So you actually built that yourself?
Yeah.
The ramp?
Yeah, me and a couple of friends. I think Kevin Conkle was probably involved, and a couple of other my neighborhood friends who also love to ride bikes.
So any broken bones come from that?
Not from that. Yeah, I had a few broken bones, but fortunately none from that. Maybe just a few, scrapes and bruises over time. But I was fortunate.
So now I have that muscle kind of persona in my head. Did that carry through high school, or you said you did some other activities?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, started, working out in high school. And I played sports early on, through the 70s and everything. But the funny thing was, by high school, like my birthday, I'm an August birthday. And so I was always the absolute youngest kid in the class. And so I was smaller than all the other guys, which it turned out to be kind of a disadvantage. So I was always kind of behind everyone physically. So, I couldn't really play football and baseball and all that stuff because I was always just a little bit smaller than all the other guys. So, I started, lifting weights, and that helped a lot. I was no longer the little kid after I started really doing that. But, and really started lifting pretty seriously in 1984. And, that's something I still do, to this day, work out 4 days a week, for going on 30 something years now. So.
Did you know what you were doing when you started lifting weights, or you just kind of messing around, or did you follow anybody in particular?
Yeah, I mean, not when I first started, probably not, but you know, it was surprising. I don't know, maybe someone left it at our house, but around 1983, someone had left a copy of Arnold Schwarzenegger's Education of a Bodybuilder at our house, and I read it. And this was a book he had written in 1977 originally. And you know, the book's really about his life and kind of what he wanted to do. And it was amazing because he wrote this in 1977 and said, you know, one day, hey, I might go on and want to tackle acting or maybe politics, and all those things actually, you know, ended up happening. But you know, Arnold was a huge inspiration to work out. And, you know, really, I mean, you know, I was, you know, like I said, from a pretty modest family and didn't have a lot. And, you know, Arnold really convinced me that I could have control of my life, which is what the book's really about. I mean, he was this fairly poor kid from Austria who ended up becoming one of the most, you know, recognized and successful people in the world. And his whole book was basically like, yeah, if you work hard and you set your mind to it, you can actually do that. And no one had really told me that in my life at that point. So I think really that stuck with me and probably really shaped my outlook about, you know, wanting to really, you know, do better, to you know, work hard, to be able to really, you know, try and build things, and was a huge influence. But, you know, not only, you know, the bodybuilding and weightlifting and everything, which I still try and do today, but just in life in general. So, and then I read, you know, he has this Encyclopedia of Bodybuilding, which is this huge book that Arnold wrote. And so I managed to get a copy of that next, and would, you know, spend hours studying, you know, the different weightlifting techniques and ways to balance out your different body parts and everything, and how to lift safely and all that kind of stuff. So absolutely the biggest influence on, you know, weightlifting and exercise.
That's really fascinating that somebody like Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was from Austria, he was into bodybuilding, right? And it's not like he was a baseball hero or a football hero, but he spoke to you, a young American boy in the middle of Texas,
right?
and really kind of shaped your outlook on life and how you approach things. That's really fascinating.
Yeah. No, he's still an interesting. I still follow Arnold. I know he's kind of controversial, especially out in California, but you know, I think you know, still a good guy, and has just done a lot in his life for. I mean, he still does so much to try and help other people. You know, in underprivileged areas, and helping people who are in prisons and everything and stuff. So he's continued to be, I think, an inspiration for me.
So because you're able to lift, right, you were able to do this.
Yeah, that was a little later in high school, but I was a yell leader, and then somehow the squad voted to actually become cheerleaders. There were 10 guys and 10 girls, and it was funny is I can't say my weightlifting was really paying off by this point, looking at the size of my arms there, but it lift my partner, you know, above my head back then. So
that's hard to do.
Yeah, it was, you know, it was some work, you know, a lot of legs too, a lot of form.
So you were a yell leader. Did you do other sports?
Like I said, you know, not really in so much in high school. Early on, you know, played the typical sports, and I, you know, really loved baseball and soccer, and gosh, I'm trying to think. Yeah, there's a couple of pictures. My mom had recently gathered these for my 50th birthday, but yeah, you can see on the card there from when I was 11 that my favorite team was the Texas Rangers, still is, and that my favorite player was Jim Sundberg, who was a catcher, and I really enjoyed playing catcher when I was in Little League in baseball. Which, as an adult, I played softball and everything, and I played a catcher there too. So,
what else? You talked earlier that music was a big influence. You know, it was an innovative time for music in general. Can you talk about that? What influenced you?
Yeah, it was, you know, I remember so much, you know, the 70s, and sort of, you know, backseat of my car listening to Fleetwood Mac and the Eagles and, you know, Led Zeppelin, and they were mainly listening to rock, but you know, just having really fond memories of that. But then you know, by the early 80s, I was, you know, had fully you know, embraced, you know, rock, and was listening at that time, you know, a lot of Rush and Van Halen and, you know, AC/DC and bands like that. And then and then and then I started playing guitar, after getting to actually see, Eddie Van Halen and on the 1984 tour, he said, "Hey, I really want to learn to play guitar and be like Eddie Van Halen," and then started getting more into like what you call, heavy metal at the time. So everything from Metallica and Scorpions and some of the, Iron Maiden and some of these other bands I could barely listen to now, but
why can you barely listen to them now?
Well, a lot of them just, when you listen to them in retrospect, just weren't that good. So the the vocals weren't that good. Sometimes the playing wasn't that good. Not Van Halen. Eddie Van Halen was still the greatest guitarist of all time in my book, but a lot of stuff is like, wow, that sounded so much better when I was like 16 than it does now when I listen to it. And then I listen to stuff like, Jim Croce or something, or Fleetwood Mac from the 70s. That sounded great then, still sounds great. So there, I think some music's just held up a lot better for me.
Yeah.
There was a lot of, even there was some like, some rap and stuff that I listened to back then with friends, because if you were a teenager in the 80s, your friends were probably playing rap music. And now when I listen to some of that, I'm like, oh, that was just not great. There's good rap now. There's a lot of great rap that's still being made. But I think some of the stuff we listened to back then was probably not as good.
So how did you get from like rock, because, a lot of those bands are just like, a rock, American rock, and then you kind of go to heavy metal in a way, right? Yeah. Some of it. Mm-hmm. And then you said that your favorite band was The Cure. How did you make that leap?
Yeah, big journey there. So around 85 or so, I'd heard U2 on the radio quite a bit. And I was like, wow, I kind of like this band, and they're kind of a little bit rockish, but they have this kind of alternative sound also. Mm-hmm. And listening to U2 and also the stations that, U2 would have been playing on at the time in Dallas started, opening up my ears to, bands like, Cure and Depeche Mode and, Cranberries, Erasure, all the bands I started listening to. And I became just really, I was surprised, honestly, that, I was this hard rock guy and really only want to listen to hard rock, and then became really interested in, in these bands that were, much more synthesized and alternative. And, and then I barely knew at that time, you have to go back to Kraftwerk in the 70s and the influence they had, and, really introducing, synthesizers. And then, by the 80s, people had really started to figure out, synthesizers, and do just about, everything, even the stuff you hear now on synthesizers, all that was pretty much figured out by the 80s. So, but, I just really enjoyed their sound, the innovation in the music that was going on in new wave and alternative at that point. The passion they put into their music was super important. And, when you're sort of a brooding teenager and going off to college by yourself, listening to Depeche Mode in your dark room, could kind of get you through a tough time, I guess, And I used to listen to music so much back then, and it's kind of funny. I didn't tell you all about this, but we listened to cassettes a lot back then. Yeah. So, and I kind of hold on to things. So, here are some of my cassettes. Oh my God. So still the exact order they would have been in from the late 80s. And so that's the first one. And then, this one's sort of the, you can see the U2 and REM and some of the more serious stuff like the GenX-er and everything. Violent Femmes.
Do you actually have something that can play those?
Theoretically, I do. I'm afraid to actually put one in a player because it'll probably just eat it immediately.
That's awesome. Yeah. Those are antiques, Steve.
Yes, they are definitely antiques at this point.
The fact that they're in order is really impressive too.
I'm a little OCD.
I was going to say, I didn't want to say, but I was going to say.
Yeah. Yes, organization is important.
Well, you're a builder. You're creating things. You mentioned video games and computers. That was also an evolutionary time in the 70s and 80s.
Oh yeah.
Tell us about what you tinkered around with.
Yeah, and it's funny. I said I keep things. So I still have our 1970s Radio Shack Pong set, which was our first video game system, which literally just had Pong, where you turn the knobs, and then it had a light gun where you could shoot at a dot that was floating around on the screen, and we'd always turn the brightness up on the TV all the way so you registered a hit every time you fired the little gun, but then finally we were able to get an Atari 2600, which I still have. And God, I mean, just the hours and hours and hours we spent on the 2600 and Missile Command and Space Invaders and the really bad version of Pac-Man, and then Pitfall came out, which was
I love Pitfall.
Yeah, and honestly, one of the early Activision games, and to this day, it's funny when I do interviews for the gaming industry, when people are asking me about my favorite games of all time. They're expecting me to say Zelda, or one of the Doom games or something. But if I list, Pitfall, they give me the funniest looks, because they're like, what, with the 8-bit graphics and little blocks and how can that be one of your favorite games? But I mean, I spent so many hours playing Pitfall, and I still don't think I ever beat it, but I spent a lot of hours playing Pitfall trying.
So it was more your own personal connection to the game, and when you were a kid and how it made you feel versus the actual mechanics of the game, right?
Yeah, and in that, one thing I would say is by the early '80s, my dear Uncle Joe actually bought me a Commodore VIC-20, and so then the builder took over, and I used to spend all night, probably even on school nights, not sleeping at all, trying to write these games in BASIC. And that's all I wanted to write was, these really, really super crude video games on my VIC-20 written in BASIC. And, the internet really didn't exist like we know it today. So, you get these magazines where they had some programs in the back, and, stay up all night, like trying to type in, the program on the VIC-20 and then saving it out. Literally, there was a cassette tape player, which I still have. And you would save your programs to these cassette tapes. And so if you wanted to load the program, you literally, like old school, you had to fast forward to the part in the tape where the program was saved, and then load it up and hope to God it worked. But in a lot of times it was just, you'd program something all night, hope it runs. Then when you turn the computer off, it was just gone. So I think that, was when my eyes were first open that, wow, you can actually, build a video game in your own home if you spend enough time on it.
So today you're a builder of games. You've taken your love from your childhood and you never grew up, and and you build games, and even in virtual reality, right? So now you're able to put gamers in the game, characters. I mean, did you ever think back then that you would be doing this?
Absolutely not. I mean, it's funny because back then, technology and like video games and everything, they weren't a career. Like, it wasn't something, it was something that a few people maybe somewhere had managed to figure out how to make money on, but it was really hit and miss. And so if you look at the years where I was making sort of like educational and career decisions, like I know I love to stay up all night trying to create video games and playing video games, but I didn't think it was a career option at that point. So I went off and studied finance and, spent the first, and, my undergrad and grad degrees were both in finance, and did quantitative finance with really, really smart people. And it was a lot of fun, but, by the late 90s, I was bored. And also I'd say, hey, wow, people are actually making money in technology and video games. And fortunately, I had some friends that I'd met in going all the way back to college who were working in the video games industry. And they kind of opened my eyes to the fact that it was a real industry. And so for me, I left a really lucrative career in finance. I mean, I was working for a great firm with some really smart people, doing really, really well in my late 20s. And I said, but wow, I can actually go off and, try and chase my childhood dreams and make a living doing what I really loved to do back then, which was creating and making video games. So been able to do that for the past, 20 years or so, and really, feel really fortunate that I was able to combine, my childhood love with what I get to do every day now.
That's awesome. So let's chat a little bit of your family today. You've got your wife and two girls, and they're like preteen teenagers, right?
Yeah, 8 and 11.
8 and 11. Okay. And then so thinking back to your own childhood and their childhood today, what are things that you brought forward from your childhood to how you're raising them, or what's something you wish that they would be able to have experienced that they don't today?
Well, the funny thing is, it's probably the worst part, maybe the best part of our era is that, just the focus we had, right? And the presence, my daughters will never know the joy of spending 5 hours in the back of a car with absolutely nothing to do but stare out the window and sing songs with your family, right? So, a lot of times I wouldn't even bring a book or anything. So, gosh, you were present, you were isolated, you had to take in the world around you. And, I think people had probably better observational skills back then because that's what you did. You were bored as everything. So you looked at the world and you looked at people and you looked at signs, you looked at cars and, all this stuff. But, now, of course, everyone has, constant attention on their smartphones and devices and, the internet and everything we have available, has really, really changed that.
That's so good. I totally agree. But I can't, I think we have to wrap up, but I can't get over the fact that you showed us your organized alphabetical mixtapes. Could you just share for the fun of it, and we'll wrap with a few more things, but maybe your top 5 to 7 favorite songs or artists, or what comes to mind when you look at those?
Yeah, well, it's funny. There's different ones, but like I said, U2 was definitely there, and The Cure, which I mentioned, and honestly, I've been able to see The Cure like 6 or 7 times, including when they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame a couple of years ago. So I saw that too. Super fun. And also Steve Nix was inducted as an individual artist, which is the first woman to be inducted twice. So it was amazing to see her that year. I'm a big, Fleetwood Mac fan. But U2, The Cure, Depeche Mode, New Order. Saw New Order actually in Miami with my best friend who also turned 50 this year, right before, the world changed with COVID. But saw them, this year, saw them about 5 years ago. So, I'd say the bands that I'm most interested in seeing are probably, those bands like The Cure and who thankfully, most of them are still around and still touring.
Yeah. It's funny, but well, not funny, but I think it is amazing that a lot of the bands are making a comeback, or they never left, but they're touring, right? And they're in their 50s and 60s. That's, God love for being able to do that already.
Yeah. Yeah, and they seemed old, when we were younger, the folks who were 30 seemed really old, but now they don't seem so old now. They're only like 15 years older than we are, maybe. So,
right.
Love it. And a small side fact, Stevie Nicks went to my high school.
Oh, nice.
I know.
Well, if you ever see her, thank her for a lifetime of jokes and references to my name. So
right. I had to bring that up because you must get that all the time, or did maybe growing up.
Still do. Yeah. Fleetwood Mac, and she really came onto the scene in the early 70s, but by the time my parents had already named me. So yeah, I was hoping to run into her at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and ceremony to thank her and tell her that most of my life it's been Stevie Nicks. Wow, I never really thought of that before, but you're right. That's going to sound the same.
Oh, fun. Well, this was awesome, Steve. Just really great hearing your stories, hearing you reflect. Loved your childhood memories and stories from, you growing up Gen X.
Oh, thank you so much. I love what y'all are doing. I really appreciate y'all spending some time with me.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we hope that everybody listening enjoyed this episode of Story Starters with Steve, brought to you by My Legacy, where we want to bring authentic stories from everyday people. So to learn more about My Legacy, go to my-legacy.com. Follow us on all of our different handles here. Thank you for being with us, and remember that all of us have a story, and we want to know yours. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.